Welcome to part three of Virginia's People Sold Downriver.
The discussion that we've had so far really is so important, and the segue we're about to take in inviting our next guest to come and talk with us is really digging deeper into the people, the lives of those individuals whose labor was stolen from them, and in some cases, their lives were stolen from them because they were separated from family members. You saw husbands and wives and children sold to different places, and in some cases they didn't survive. In other cases, they did survive, and their families later on continued with that powerful resilience and determination to thrive. But of course, what was left in the past was brought with them. The trauma of this separation was brought with them, but the determination to make a life for themselves was so important. And so I would like to bring into our discussion an important researcher who's the youngest person in the nation to become a certified genealogist. His expertise in tracing the genealogy of African Americans before 1870, especially those who landed in Louisiana, has been critical to this project. I'd like to welcome Mr. Alexander Traps Jabala, founder and president of Kin Connect. Welcome, Mr. Traps Jabala, and I'm going to hand this part of our discussion over to Dr. Richmond.
Welcome, Alex.
Hi, thank you so much for the welcome.
Thank you. So, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to be a part of this project?
So, yeah, the intro said it all, but I am a genealogist and historian. I specialize in researching enslaved people. One of my goals, of course, is to make family history a very accessible and equitable experience for Black folks and other people of color.
Great. Can you tell us a little bit about what happened to enslaved people once they were shipped to New Orleans?
Thank you. So, once folks were shipped to New Orleans via the domestic slave trade, they would arrive in the port of New Orleans and then be taken to to one of many jails and depots around the city, specifically located around the French Quarter and the Central Business District in today's New Orleans. After that, they'd be placed at various auctions, usually happening in the St. Charles hotels, Banks Arcade, coffee houses, so on and so forth. And planters, businessmen, businesswomen from essentially all over the Deep South, but especially here in Louisiana, would bid on each of these individuals and then take them their to their respective businesses, homes, or plantations, usually outside of the city of New Orleans.
Great. So, you've got a little bit into this. Who was likely to buy enslaved Virginians in these marketplaces? And where did the majority of them wind up, and what kind of work were they doing?
Very good question. So the buyers of enslaved Virginians was very diverse, but for the most part, the majority of enslaved Virginians would be taken to some of the sugar and cotton plantations that lined the Mississippi River. And so going all the way up the Mississippi River from the port of New Orleans, all the way into northern Louisiana, the river parishes just outside of New Orleans, up into Arkansas, Mississippi, as well as some going into Missouri as well. And so you have this very diverse range of buyers, but essentially they'd be going to plantations mainly. Although many Virginians were incredibly skilled laborers, such as carpenters, blacksmiths, brick masons, so on and so forth. And then also with women, very skilled in domestic labor. And so many of them could also end up in the urban slave market as well. And so staying there in New Orleans and other cities around the Gulf Coast.
What kind of work were they doing?
So the primary work that they'd be doing on the plantation in particular, which is where the majority of the folks would go, would be field labor. So cultivating for closer to New Orleans, we have what's called the river parishes or the sugar district. And so most of them would be engaged in the cultivation of sugar um, on massive plantations around the Mississippi River. The further up you go and into the interior of the state, you have more cotton labor, more cotton plantations that became very popular with the American purchase of Louisiana. And so what happens there is some of the same labor intensive work that we have seen described in cotton plantations around the South. However, in Louisiana, the work was very intensive because there was a high yield in some of the lands here because of the fertile Mississippi River Valley. There was, tons of cotton production, tons of sugar production, and because the port was right here, there was a high demand, and so these folks would be worked to the bone essentially from sun up to sundown. And so that was the primary labor of enslaved folks. But on top of that, folks also were required to, if they had families or kinship in their on their plantations, they were also required to care for their family. They were required to care for the families of their owners and the surrounding, power system. And so there's multiple forms of labor that exist. Unfortunately for women, oftentimes there was a level of sex work and sex trafficking um, with enslaved women, and so that was another primary labor force in many ways. And so again, the labor portion of it is very diverse because again, you had skilled workers and skilled laborers, but especially the skilled field laborers as well.
So, can you tell us a little bit about how to trace ancestors who lived in Louisiana? Are the records there different than other places in the South?
Yeah, so Louisiana, in terms of records, record cultivation and the way that records even were written at the time, marches to a beat of its own drum compared to the rest of the country. Louisiana operates under the Napoleonic Code, and that legal system still exists today. Most other states are operating from a more Anglo-centric um, legal code. Louisiana operates from a very Francophone and Spanish code, and so we have what's called the notarial system, and so notaries were the principal recorders of each transaction in the state of Louisiana. And so as a result, we have tons of records of enslaved people because they were one of the primary quote unquote commodities here. They're recorded very often from bank transactions to one-off, exchanges between two individuals. Enslaved folks are recorded very often there. And as a result, one of the things that happens with Louisiana, because it had such a high population of Black folks here, many people can trace their ancestry to these enslaved individuals. And only until recently has access to these documents been a more common topic. However, it's still very untouched. And so one of the primary ways to trace enslaved ancestors in Louisiana is to of course, start with yourself and do the whole genealogical process, but especially to identify the parishes in other states that would be considered counties where your ancestors are known to have lived, and to try to see if there's any connections to enslavers in the area. Because Louisiana enslaved so many people, you have, instead of other states where many people will take the same last name of their last enslaver, people in Louisiana are coming with last names from the upper South, from the deep South, and that may not align with all of the people that are local to the area. And so, identifying each of the large enslavers, small enslavers in the area, and tediously checking to see if in within those records they have anyone that matches, a first name of your ancestor or a family grouping that is similar to what you've been able to find about your ancestors in freedom. That's the first step.
Wow, that's intense. So, to give us some illustration, can you share with our audience a sample of how you uncovered one family's history that began in Virginia and continued in Louisiana because of the domestic slave trade?
Absolutely. Out of the many that we've discovered with the Soul Down River Project, there's one compelling story that stood out to me was that of the family of York and Betsy. York and Betsy was an enslaved couple originally from Surrey County, Virginia, that was enslaved by the Falcon family of Surrey County. They were a large enslaving family who, because of multiple deaths in the white family, decided to settle the estate via auctions. And York and Betsy happened to fall within that category. And so York and Betsy were taken from Surrey County and left the port of Norfolk, arriving in New Orleans, and were purchased by a man named um, Pierre Fanor Prudhomme. Pierre Fanor Prudhomme was a member of the large Prudhomme family of Natchitoches Parish. They were one of the earlier settlers of Louisiana, or the earlier French settlers of Louisiana, and were also credited as being one of the first to cultivate cotton in the state of Louisiana. And so they were members of this huge um, colony of interrelated Creole enslavers who accumulated incredible amounts of wealth on the backs of enslaved people. And York and Betsy happens to fall in that category. One of the most unique details about York and Betsy was that they were sold with their children who ranged in age from, I want to say, as old as 20 to, near infants. That was something that was a very rare occurrence for such a large family, and diverse family, in terms of gender and age range, to be sold collectively in that way without clear separations. What we know from the records is that most of York and Betsy's family were able to remain intact until the end of the Civil War. Many of them still living in Cane River in Natchitoches Parish to this day, but also their descendants number in the hundreds throughout the country and if not world now. I've been able to make contact with many of their descendants, some who are even related to me. But part of it was that they did not retain an oral history about the origins of their ancestors, York and Betsy, some of them not even knowing their names because neither York nor Betsy survived to see emancipation. However, several of their children would. That said, family memory did not retain enough oral history to really fill in the gaps in terms of what their experience would be. And so Soul Down River was able to actually reconstruct as much of the story as we could. Of course, lacking the voices of York and Betsy, but we can see from the records at least a glimpse into what they would have experienced being transported so far and removed from home.
So, do you have any idea kind of the size of the farm or plantation in Virginia they came from and what might have been grown there? And then you said they went to Cane River, which was a cotton and maybe some sugar cane, I'm assuming from the name of the place.
Mhm. So back in Surrey County, Virginia, the Falcons were both a mercantile family and a farming family with deep roots in Virginia, and some in North Carolina. They were also a very political family, and so some of the chief magistrates came from this family. And in the meantime, one of the principal things that they cultivated was tobacco for many years. As the land was becoming over cultivated, as well as the family breaking down the size of their plantations, of course, room for expanded wealth really relied on enslaved people and the sale of enslaved people, and less on the cultivation of tobacco. Many members of the white family before the end of the Civil War would gravitate to places like Norfolk, DC, and other urban centers because they were becoming less reliant on their agricultural enterprises. But the plantation that they were on, but it was a really large plantation. In Cane River, one of the main things that York and Betsy were engaged in, and because of the records that exist for this particular plantation, we're able to see the amount of bales of cotton that each of them, including their children, hauled in per day, per week, and per year. Over a consecutive amount of years. That's fairly rare across surviving and existing records of slavery in the United States. And so we actually know for sure how much labor they were performing in terms of cotton cultivation, as well as building fences, collecting trash, and hauling things between plantations and into market, so on and so forth. And we have an extensive amount of records showing what their lives were like, including dates that they were considered sick, pregnant, away, so on and so forth.
Oh, that's really interesting and exciting to be able to tell the lives of two people who even their own family didn't have memories of. So thank you so much. I look forward to seeing the completed essay on their lives and their descendants.
Well, thank you, Dr. Richmond. I would like to thank you and all of our guests, Troy Vallows, Alexander Traps Jabala, and Yokota Strong, for participating in our important podcast. Your work is amazing, and your stories are absolutely riveting. I look forward to the release of your work. I also want to thank all of you, our listeners, for tuning into our podcast and discussion. And I'd like to end with an insightful statement from Winston Churchill. He said, "The farther backward you can look, the farther forward you are likely to see." Stay tuned for our next podcast.